Almost without warning, the text just shifts away from the 16-year-old's cognitive experience and plunges directly into advanced spatial rendering.
Yeah, suddenly we're reading about neural radiance fields optimizing continuous volumetric scene functions.
It's a lot.
And a paragraph later, it jumps into 3D Gaussian splatting and anisotropic 3D Gaussian primitives. Then, bam, we arrive at Trellis 2.0, and it's breaking down field-free sparse O-voxel representations. I mean, it reads exactly like a post-grad computer science paper.
It really does. So the weakness here is that the framing completely loses sight of the student agency argument established just pages prior.
Right.
I understand the impulse to establish the technological realities of the current media landscape, but it feels like reading a driver's ed manual that suddenly forces you to study an intricate schematic of a combustion engine.
Yeah, that's...
I mean, does a secondary educator or a film student need to know the thermodynamics of the engine to understand how to parallel park?
Well, I might push back slightly on the engine analogy there.
Oh, how so?
I'd argue that understanding the engine actually is necessary in this specific context, because the architecture of these rendering tools dictates the boundaries of what the student can achieve in a classroom.
Okay, fair point.
The problem isn't the inclusion of the computer science, it's that the mechanism of spatial rendering is currently divorced from the pedagogical goal. The text just lists these technologies without maintaining the thread of the adolescent's cognitive load.
Right, so the suggestion to resolve this disconnect is to anchor the technical descriptions of spatial rendering directly and explicitly to the evolving literacy framework and the student's cognitive load.
Exactly. Every single technical mechanism explained should be immediately justified by how it serves the pedagogical goal of giving students spatial authorship. You have to translate the computer science back into the language of education.
Let's give a concrete example of how to execute that translation. Let's look at the section on 3D Gaussian splatting.
Sure.
Instead of merely stating that it uses rasterization and eliminates neural network queries at inference time.
Which is just pure technical jargon.
Right. The author should reframe this architectural efficiency as the exact mechanism that allows a high schooler on a standard, underpowered classroom Chromebook to manipulate a 3D scene in real time.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that completely changes the stakes of the paragraph.
Doesn't it? You explain that this real-time editability is what preserves their creative flow. If a student uses an older technology like NeRFs and has to wait 10 minutes for a cloud-based neural network to render a single camera pan,
that latency induces the exact same frustration and cognitive overload they experienced when struggling to draw by hand.
Exactly. The technology defeats its own purpose. Rasterization solves a cognitive problem, not just a computational one.
That is such a stronger angle. And we can apply that same strategy when the text discusses TRLLS, two structured latent models.
Oh, definitely.
As another concrete example, the author should explicitly tie the speed of those O-voxels back to Bandura's social cognitive theory, which was heavily featured earlier. You know, Bandura emphasizes mastery experiences.
Right. Those early, tangible successes a novice needs to build confidence.
Exactly. So show how the instantaneous navigable 3D generation provides that exact rapid success. When a student types a prompt and immediately navigates a 3D manifestation of their idea, it builds that generative self-efficacy.
Yeah, if the technology is the engine creating the mastery experience, the technical explanation of that engine belongs firmly inside the pedagogical narrative.
Validating the student's psychological journey.
Exactly. But building that generative self-efficacy through instantaneous rendering brings up a pretty dangerous double-edged sword.
Right.
The discussion of unstructured AI usage correctly identifies the risk of semantic homogenization, yet the framework relies heavily on the promise of student-directed knowledge creation without fully resolving this tension.
Yeah, the text cites Balta Salvador's randomized crossover study to show how unguided AI usage results in semantic homogenization.
Basically, students express ideas using highly similar linguistic patterns.
Right, because the AI naturally pulls everything toward the median of its training data, leading to incredibly generic outputs.
So the weakness is that while the proposed prompt-to-presence workflow promises agentic autonomy, there's a huge gap in explaining how exactly this workflow overcomes the AI's inherent bias toward homogenization.
The text asserts that prompt engineering will solve this, but it completely lacks an operational definition of what substantial, iterative control looks like in the face of these algorithmic biases.
Which raises a really profound critical question. If the AI is filling in all the perceptual gaps that the student couldn't draw,
Right.
if it's choosing the exact angle of the cyberpunk building, the precise shade of the neon lighting, the grunge texture on the street.
Who is really the author of the final film?
Exactly. I love that question. If a student simply types "make a cool futuristic city" and accepts the result, that isn't authorship. That is just commissioning an illustration.
Absolutely. So my suggestion to strengthen the unstructured AI usage and ethical AI application sections is to define the specific pedagogical mechanics of idea code development.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
The author needs to detail exactly how secondary educators can teach students to intentionally challenge, subvert, and reject the AI's initial logic to ensure diverse novel outcomes. We need to know what pushing back against the algorithm actually looks like in a classroom.
Right. So, for a concrete example of this idea code development, the author could provide a brief hypothetical contrast in the literature review.
Yeah?
First, describe a homogenized interaction. A student prompts the AI for a sci-fi city. The 3D Gaussian splatting generates a generic Blade Runner-esque skyline based on the median of its training data, and the student just passively accepts it.
Right. And then immediately contrast that with an agentic iterative loop. Show a student actively utilizing prompt engineering to reject that spatial rendering.
Oh, that's good. They recognize the homogenization.
Exactly. And they force the model to integrate specific, divergent cultural aesthetics or unique lighting constraints that actually match their original cinematic vision. You have to show the student fighting the algorithm for control.
The text also brings up the data painting methodologies of the artist Refik Anadol as an industry parallel.
Yes, where he trains AI models on custom datasets.
Right, but focusing on Anadol purely as a lofty, professional example kind of overlooks how a 16-year-old can actually apply this concept.
That is another great opportunity for a concrete example. Incorporate Anadol not just as an industry parallel, but as a specific, scalable model for the secondary classroom.
How so?
Explain how students might curate their own mini data sets to combat homogenization. Imagine a student taking their phone and photographing the brutalist concrete architecture around their own school, or the specific rusted lockers in their hallway.
Oh, I see. If they feed those specific, localized architectural photos into the latent space, they're training the AI to produce customized, non-generic outputs.
Exactly. They're forcing the generative model to use their personal visual vocabulary.
By including that concrete classroom example, you transform prompt engineering from a passive text request into active, highly curated authorship. It proves the student is the director and the AI is merely the crew.
I love that framing. But once you have a student curating their own datasets and fighting back against the algorithm, you have to actually measure if they feel like an author.
Right. The rationale for qualitative inquiry is presented as a methodological aside, missing an opportunity to frame student voice as the ultimate measure of the study's proposed evolving literacy.
Yeah, looking at the structure, there is a paragraph titled Interpretive Rationale for Qualitative Inquiry, but currently it's sandwiched squarely within the theoretical framework.
Right after social cognitive theory, which is just...
It's placed so awkwardly. That placement severely disrupts the conceptual flow.
So the weakness is that it reads as a defensive justification for a mixed methods design rather than a theoretical necessity driven by the literature.
Exactly. It feels like the author is apologizing for using qualitative methods.
Which is incredibly ironic. I mean, this is a paper fundamentally focused on elevating student agency, moving them from passive consumers to active co-creators.
And yet they're burying the very mechanism designed to capture the student's voice deep inside a theoretical summary.
Exactly. We also have to consider the context of the existing K-12 AI literature here.
Right, because if you look at the broader research landscape, it focuses so heavily on automated grading or intelligent tutoring systems or...
The panic around students using Ch2 to write essays.
Yes, it is overwhelmingly quantitative. It entirely misses the affective, lived experience of adolescents collaborating with AI in the creative arts.
So the suggestion to resolve this structural issue is to relocate and integrate the qualitative rationale directly into the research gap section.
Right. Position the severe lack of qualitative student voices in current K-12 AI literature not just as a methodological choice, but as a primary, glaring gap that this specific study uniquely addresses.
For a concrete example of how to execute this structural shift, the author could add a synthesis paragraph under the secondary media education and participatory culture gap.
Oh, yeah.
This paragraph would explicitly argue that quantitative instruments, like, say, measuring a change in perceived career readiness on a 5-point Likert scale,
Right.
they are structurally unable to capture the perceived locus of authorship. You simply cannot quantify the visceral feeling a student gets when they realize they can finally visualize a complex world they imagined, but previously lacked the motor skills to draw.
A Likert scale cannot capture the nuance of a student negotiating aesthetic control with an algorithm.
Exactly. So the author should frame research question 5, which asks how students describe their sense of creative agency during the transition to spatial visualization, as the direct solution to this literature gap.
It is vital to show the reader that capturing these subjective meaning-making dimensions is the absolute only way to prove if the prompt-to-presence workflow is actually successful.
Yeah, if this new concept of evolving literacy is truly about elevating a student's cognitive focus toward conceptual ideation, you have to actually talk to the student to find out if that elevation occurred inside their own mind.
By moving this rationale to the research gaps, the qualitative component is transformed from an obligatory methodological footnote into the philosophical core of the study. It proves exactly why the research is necessary.
Reviewing a literature review of this scope reveals an incredibly exciting framework, one that really respects both the advanced capabilities of modern AI and the complex cognitive realities of the adolescent learner.
It really does. But to ensure that framework reaches its full potential, the author has 3 critical realignments to make. First, ensure that the technical explanations of spatial rendering strictly serve the pedagogical arguments regarding cognitive load and student agency.
Second, clearly define how iterative prompt engineering and idea co-development actively combat semantic homogenization, preserving true student authorship.
And third, reposition the qualitative rationale into the research gaps to highlight the absolute necessity of capturing the student's affective experience.
We invite the listener to implement these structural and thematic alignments and submit the revised chapter back for further